record on this computer. So I am now, am I recording? I think so, I'm recording. Okay, so Adrienne, do you just want to introduce yourself and just give us a little bit of a background on where you're coming from?
So my name is Adrienne Mackey. I'm the founder and artistic director of Swim Pony Performing Arts, which is a, well, it began as an immersive theater company. It's sort of since migrated into what I call sort of a creator of playful experience. So I'm sort of interested in what does it mean to be curious and aware of your surroundings in lots of different ways. Yeah, I think that's pretty good intro.
I mean, you use the word, I've checked out a couple of your videos, and you use the word transmedial. Transmedial or transmedia? I think it's transmedial.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like the terminology in this realm is so squishy still, like nobody knows exactly what to call it. Like I've heard mixed reality, I've heard transmedial, I've like I've heard alternate reality or like virtual reality audio. And sometimes it sort of depends on who I'm talking to, like what words I'll use, sort of depending on what I think is gonna like help them understand the best, like what exactly this funky thing of like using sound to actually key you into your surroundings really means.
What about locative audio?
You know, it's funny, like until we chatted the first time, like I'd never seen it put that particular way, which I think is like another, like I've heard, like geolocative is another one that I've heard a bunch, which I don't use as much here, especially with like theater audiences, because that's just like not a space that people like think about when they think about theater, which is often where I'm pulling from. But I do like locative because it gives that sense of moving, which is so much of what the work is about.
Yeah, I like it because it puts the emphasis on the audio, and it means that you're not vision based, you're not screen based. And I love the sense that audio is playing that sort of in between the world around you and the sort of imaginary world that you're hearing. I love the fact that audio is that sort of interlocutor. Yeah.
I think to me, it's, I know that there are so many people obsessed with the screen, but I actually think that audio is magic in that way. There's an exercise actually that I do when I start teaching people how to think about like relating to space, where I have them look out a window and I say, describe to me something that could be happening there. And part of the thing that I think happens when you're hearing somebody, I was actually I was in a panel the other day where somebody was talking about a scientist who like measures physiological responses to, it was like they were measuring like the audiobook of Game of Thrones versus like the television show of Game of Thrones. And there actually are more, like though people reported being more engrossed in the television show, their physiological response, in particular their like imaginative brain waves, are just like off the charts with audio, because it requires you to like show up and actually meet the work in a different way, which is part of why actually like I'm really resistant to screens. But I think that like immersive technology in relationship to like something that like requires you to go out here is so magic.
So give us a breakdown of what's going on with TrailOff.
So TrailOff is a project that is a collaboration between my company, Swim Pony, the Pennsylvania Environmental Council, which is a statewide organization that advocates for the natural environment, and an app developer based in Canada called Toaster Lab. It was kind of like a crazy idea that I had. I'm a distance runner, and I was using the app Zombies Run, which I thought was, you know, sort of like this fun little game where you have this like thing where the story is relating to the physical action that you're doing, and you're running around the city, like imagining you're being chased by zombies. And I thought, I had this moment where I was running and I thought, God, if this experience could actually be in literal relationship, not just sort of like the idea of running through a city, but if the story could be referencing the actual things that I was seeing, I'd feel like I was sort of like plunked in the middle of a movie. And it's that thing that I think as a theater director, actors get to do in this magic way where they literally get to like put themselves into other narratives. And so I was just like kicking this idea around forever, and then happened to meet somebody from the Pennsylvania Environmental Council. I said, like, oh my God, like, let me talk to your boss. I have this idea for nature trails that I've just been dying to find somebody to connect with about. And they let me in the door. And part of the conversation that evolved out of the potential partnership was, you know, art has this amazing capacity to like bridge people's ability to see things in new ways. And one of the problems that the environmental sector has is they're not great at reaching sort of like the full diversity of people that like should be accessing these natural spaces. And I said, well, what if we could get, you know, 10 writers to create stories specifically for these trails to like test this awesome idea of like storytelling in space. And they could also like create a lens on these places that maybe most people wouldn't associate. Like, you know, you don't necessarily think of nature trail and imagine like Afak, who is this Sudanese poet who wrote this beautiful story about the Sudanese revolution in relationship to this nature trail on a river. So once that partnership with Peck solidified, I called in Toaster Lab, who had been somebody that I'd been sort of anecdotally chatting. And I said, you know, we're both really interested in how to use technology to make this kind of live experience more accessible. Would you be interested in doing something that used GPS triggering to actually like get the feel of a live performance for audiences of one using the audio? And that's kind of like how the thing came together. So over the past, 3 years now, we did like a year of workshopping just to try to think about like, what are the stories that fit this kind of unique format of place, technology, and storytelling. And then we went through a process of finding and identifying and bringing the writers on. I worked with them personally to develop their stories, and then cast them and worked with a sound designer and composer named Mike Kiley, who oversaw all the sound, like 360 binaural sound design for all of the stories. So really had an eye on the entire piece. And then we, you know, went through that whole process of like editing and mixing and mastering. And we're just at the point where we're about to get the alpha version of the app.
Wow.
The project, yeah, it's like, so we're going to probably get it sometime early July. So
have you tested it on site yet?
So part of what Toaster Lab did is they built us like they're using it in a number of applications, but they built a mapping tool basically that is sort of like the underlying engine, so that you can plop in, you know, all of the audio tools and then like set all of the different parameters of like, this will play and then it'll crossfade this and then it'll wait 10 seconds and all that kind of stuff. So they did all of that, and now they're actually like plugging in all of the specific cues that I came up with for the actual stories that we built.
So you haven't actually gone out on site and walked it as an experience, a fully completed experience yet?
Not through the app. I mean, I have with all of the completed audio, sort of like knowing where the GPS triggers are supposed to go. So I have a sense of like what it will feel like, but the app hasn't done it for me yet.
That's going to be a really interesting experience for you.
I know. So we're still in that like moment of inhale before we can finally like,
Has Toaster Lab done stuff like this before?
Yeah, they did a piece called Transmission for the Edinburgh Fringe 2 or 3 years ago. And it was also a geolocative storytelling experience. It was a little different. Like you had the map of the city, and it was kind of an imaginative piece about travel to Mars and kind of a metaphor for like refugees and what does it mean to leave home. Mm-hmm. And so you could actually like walk around the city, and then when you were within, you know, like the certain space of like the different triggers, it would pull up different kinds of media. In some cases it was audio, in some cases it was video, in some cases they actually had a live performance. So it's sort of like this amazing collage piece. But they do all kinds of, I mean, they're actually they have a mixed reality atelier that they're working on right now. And so they're actually like have a constellation of projects that are all in conversation with each other, kind of in this realm.
Fascinating. Yeah, it sounds like they probably had a big learning curve with that one, I reckon.
Yeah.
We're rebuilding our app, and there's so many questions. There's so many questions that sort of come up in terms of the usability, the functionality, the applicability, the longevity of these systems, and where this is all going. So,
Yeah.
that's really kind of where I'm at with a lot of this at the moment. So what was it like working with the writers? I mean, I spoke to you, I think about a year ago, and I think you just put out an EOI to prospective writers who might be interested in coming in. To me, I have to say, it looked like the most incredibly gorgeous sort of offer to go and sort of be in literally a log cabin somewhere in the kind of forest in America. I thought was most interesting. But from what I gleaned, that wasn't quite what happened, was it?
So, I mean, the residency wasn't a residency in the traditional sense. It was sort of like a 3-month period where we said, like, this is your trail, visit as often as you want. Sort of, I think so much of this project was like such a big learning process. And I think if there's anything I'll say about the writers, they were so game and so generous to figure it out as we went. And it was an incredibly collaborative process. We had, we knew that we wanted to have like certain markers. We kind of didn't even know exactly what those should be, but we did have a series of check-ins. Like we did a workshop with all of the writers at the start of the project, partly just because most of them had never worked in this kind of space before. So I gave them this kind of like big packet of lessons that I had personally learned from like working on storytelling insights from a series of workshops that I did with our collaborators and with the app developers, sort of saying like, a novel is different than a screenplay, is different than a play, is different than, a radio drama. And so what is it about a story where a person is walking in space, listening to audio, looking at things that's uniquely that format? And what kinds of stories exist best in that particular dynamic? So, we introduced them to the project, had them like literally like, those microphones that like are shaped like ears, we had them like get to like see that and like walk around and record themselves and then put it on and like understand how it worked. Later in the process, I would literally walk the trail with them and just have them talk to me about the stories that they were creating. And some of that was sort of like, how granular can the GPS triggering be, and what kind of uncertainty are you going to have to deal with? What kinds of things like can't you trust will stay in the landscape, and how are seasons going to affect the different things? And then also like, how are you going to anticipate the user doing all kinds of different things? Like if you can't control how fast they walk or how slow they go, how can the story expand and contract to allow them not to feel controlled by what's happening? A lot of the writers, I think, started like wanting to tell the walker or journeyer or audience, whatever you want to call them, like a lot of commands. And I think over time, many of them figured out really smart ways to sort of like suggest and guide people, as opposed to a kind of like Simon Says approach to the stories. So, and then after, like once the first drafts of the scripts came in, I read them, gave feedback. Ultimately, the content was totally theirs to shape, but it was really sort of based on my experience in this realm. Here's what I think is going to work well. And here are the technical problems I think we're going to have to solve in terms of actually translating this into files that can go into a spreadsheet that actually like gets triggered off of a particular cue. So that was like a really exciting process, especially for some of the ones where there are like branches where you have to make a choice. It's not just a line. Yeah, and then, some of them recorded their own stories. Some of them decided that they wanted to have like a pretty hands-off part of the recording process. Some of them were in the recording studio and got to see the actors in rehearsal. So it was, each one was very, very individualized. And I think that's one of the things that I think audiences will see in the outcomes, is that each story really had its own process that was really tailored to what the writer needed out of creating it, and also spoke to the material that they were going after.
I get the feeling that it was very focused on the writer and their process, and they look like an amazing bunch of people. I mean, I've just checked out a couple of them, and they really do look like an incredible cohort of people, and I'm kind of jealous in a way. I'm really reminded that I don't live in North America. But I wonder to what extent you drew their awareness to, I guess, the sound that, or the tonal quality that the landscape has, and also the I guess that the layers of kind of history and populations and sort of people and the voices that are sort of redolent within landscapes. Because I having listened to just like those 10 clips that you sent through, and I listened to that one beautiful piece, which I think was on the tail end of your public presentation, which I thought was really impressive, actually. It really reminded me of a really great piece of literature. But I was really conscious that it was very much sort of an interior world of a writer that I was doing, as opposed to a kind of a sense experience that's going to sort of bring up the different voices, the different histories, the different sort of permutations of the landscape and all its different iterations.
Well, I think it's interesting. Those 30-second clips in some ways don't do total justice to the full experiences. Because one of the things that is true about all the stories is that there's this kind of give and take. So I studied classical opera in another lifetime. And one of the metaphors I used for the writers was to think about the experience as an alternation between aria and recitative. And in opera, the recitative is the place where you get all of the plot, right? So it's relatively simple melodically. The person comes out, they sort of say like, Franz is sleeping with Helga, and then they went off, and this is the big thing, and you get all this plot forward. And then you have the person come out, and then they sing the aria, which is sort of this moment of verticality, where you really get to sink into emotion and the kind of interior life of the character, which is different than kind of the forward motion of the plot. And in all of the pieces, the interstitial music, and it's not interstitial because it really is like a core piece of the experience, I think is an opportunity to take the dialogue and scene experience that you just heard and then kind of process it in relationship to the space. So you'll have, I'm trying to think of something that's not going to I guess it doesn't matter if I give anything away, but so for example, in one of the stories, Jacob Camacho, who is himself an indigenous, he is a person who identifies as indigenous to Guam, not this area. And he felt really strongly about writing stories about the indigenous people of this area, the Nanticoke Lenape. And so we, over the course of the process, sort of like tried to figure out how to key him into that history. A lot of the official places that initially we would have recommended didn't have a lot of the indigenous history available to him. So eventually we finally got connected to somebody who is Nanticoke Lenape and was able to she actually now has a co-writing credit in the story and voiced one of the characters. And so working with her in the writing of the piece, we also were able to make a connection to a musician who's part of an amazing group called Red Blanket Singers. And so Ty Dancing Wolf Ellis came into the studio and built and sang us these beautiful pieces of music. So you'll have a scene where you get to hear the main character, who's sort of a stand-in for Jacob, kind of like time travel back and have a conversation with a character. And then you'll have 5 minutes where you get to walk and listen to this piece of music that's in relationship to the story. And that's just one example. I mean, all of the pieces sort of, I cannot speak highly enough about our composer, Mike Kiley, who was able to really sort of navigate both like creating original music and sound design, but also bringing in musicians in culturally appropriate and specific ways to sort of speak to the content of the piece. So, you know, it's that kind of thing that happens when you like walk around a space with music in your ears, and like the story you know, the news or an event in your life or whatever you've just been taking in kind of on a conscious level, just before that, starts to like mingle and have a conversation with whatever music you're in and the visuals that you're in relationship to. So I think it's a long-winded way of saying, like, I think there is this kind of like recitative piece of the scene work, but then there are these moments where the music becomes kind of the aria that allows you to process and reflect.
Yeah. I got, well, I was exploring doing a piece up here at a piece of rainforest not far away from where I live, and it's a 40-hectare beautiful piece of old growth rainforest. And one of the points that was raised was that they didn't want people wearing headphones, because if they were wearing headphones, then they were going to be sort of disembodied from the world around them. And the whole purpose of the locative thing was to actually engage them with the world around them. So we talked about using, I don't know if you've seen those Bose kind of around the shoulder sort of ones, which give you 360 binaural sound, but they don't disconnect you. And then the issue then was that anyone who was walking past was going to have to hear this as well, and that wasn't necessarily going to work well. I think we got a bit stuck at that point. So that sort of symbiosis, or that relationship between the listening experience and the world around you, you know, is a really interesting one for me.
Just a quick side note. So we did a little workaround cheat for that, where our sound designer would actually just walk the trail. And so he would get, you know, like in situ sound. And in many cases, like you actually couldn't tell that the background noise that sounded like the trail wasn't present tense trail, because it had been recorded on site. So he like took the time to actually get the unique audio for those spaces.
Yeah, there's this whole kind of theory around this with geolocative stuff now, with this idea of the sort of the disconnection where audio is suggesting things and it might have been recorded, you know, 6 months ago, but the mere fact that it's suggested sort of becomes almost like our reality when we're walking it in the present. And that locative audio in particular can really sort of muck around with people's sense of space and reality with this one. Yeah. I guess you've got, you know, if you've got nature trails, that's a real plus, because you've got an unencumbered walk, I take it, you know. Mind you, I did have a look at a couple of the pictures, looked like they were really urbanized sort of places underneath bridges and alongside big walls.
Yeah, we intentionally, well, when I say we, both the Pennsylvania Environmental Council and I really wanted to, so all of the trails are part of the Circuit Trail Network, which is 500 interconnected miles of trail in and around the Philadelphia region. And one of the things that Peck was really interested in was sort of helping people realize these trails are all over the place and they look lots of different ways. And so we very intentionally have a mix of trails that are in sort of urban or semi-industrial environments. We have trails that are kind of suburban, and then we have ones that are like really way out there. So they're a big mix. And many of them, actually some of my favorite stories are not the most spectacularly beautiful trails. They're the ones you might overlook. And I think in some ways sort of speak to the larger missions of the piece around like, what are the histories of spaces that you might assume are unremarkable until you really learn more about them.
Do you guys have any sort of legacy from this project after it runs its course for a year? I understand it's up for a year. And then is there any talk about a legacy for it?
Well, I mean, we have made radio edit archives of all the stories. So my guess, some of it depends on if the project has another season. We're currently in talks with some funders and have a few particular writers in mind to do a season 2 of the project in Philly. And also interested in, like, is there a world where TrailOff becomes something that is beyond this particular region? So sort of depending on like whether the app gets another season will depend on whether on how it has a legacy. Like there could be a world where if we just decide to cut it at season 1, we just put them up for people to go and walk and kind of know about. But like everything, so much of it is just based on money.
I mean, you're the second person who I've spoken to who's doing locative, what I would kind of call locative sort of theatre pieces, or, really kind of the emphasis is much more on sort of the art form and working with the artists than necessarily it being a sort of study in locative audio. And I remember the first time I spoke to you and this other fellow, this is also the same thing. You both sort of referred to theatre, runs for a season and then lights out, curtains down. And I'm sort of like, no, you've got to be kidding, So that's still the case at the moment.
I mean, we have some strong leads about a season 2, and I think if we do a season 2, we'd maintain the first season of stories and add to it, so the app would have an opportunity to maintain. I mean, I will say, like, as a theater artist, I sort of love an ephemeral medium. Actually, I kind of love the idea that, like, because people have definitely said, well, can you just send us the audio and so we could listen to it not on the trails? And there's a part of me that's just like, no, like, I can't do that. You have to be there.
Yeah. For me, I've spent 7 years now working in this field. I feel an incredible sense of responsibility for the people that I'm working with, particularly Aboriginal communities. And the idea that it goes up for a short period of time and then it sort of disappears is almost heretical. And that they're often, particularly with the communities I've worked with, they're often communities that are totally unrepresented. They've never really had the opportunity to talk about their things, let alone have the respect afforded to them where people can walk on that location and actually get to hear that they have some sort of legitimacy with their history, with their family ties, with their connections with these places. So the ongoing legacy of that stuff's really important for me. And I'd be curious to know what Toaster Lab's thinking about that, and be curious to see whether even we could have a chat to them about it, because this is an issue which we're talking about with an organisation now in Europe called Walk, Listen, Create. And Walk, Listen, Create are currently exploring what you call an open platform, or an open. I'm going to use the word maps. I'm going to get trouble with this, but that's where you can actually dislocate the map from the platform, and the map contains all the essential ingredients, whether it's looped audio, whether it's background audio, whether it's primary audio, whether it's got images, whether it's got text, etc., etc. And you can dislocate that from the platform and you can take it over to another platform. And that way there's this kind of sense that there'll be an ongoing longevity. There'll be some sense of perpetuity about these works as works of art themselves. So yeah, if kind of, if you want to mention that to Toaster Lab, we'd probably love having a chat to them.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that's tricky with ours is that it isn't, the files are so, I mean, I admit, like, my specialty is the construction of the like logic, not the actual coding. And I think the fear is that if the operating system starts to get in the way of the actual delivery mechanism, that's when it actually starts to, like, get to a point where you're not actually getting the experience that's intended. And there is a version where I guess you could keep all of the map-based triggers. The problem is just like the complexity, you know, like I'm just thinking of like one example off the top of my head. Like there's a scene where we have this kind of amazing Afrofuture climate apocalypse mystery story where there's a character who she's like coming from the locked down center of the city to like the hinterlands in search of this like missing set of twins, and she's like a rogue reporter, and she's like out on the trail, and she has like a tape recorder, and she like clicks on the tape recorder, and she's like talking through all the things that she's collected and like giving you information that she's like seeing in the landscape. And we have this moment where there's a fork in the road and you have to know which way to go. And so we've actually built the queue so that that's all chunked up, and there's actually like a click off that's based on when you get to a certain part in the story. So the logic of the triggering like will play unless you hit this point, and then it'll jump that piece of audio in the thing. So it's like, and then I was going to oh, I got to take a left at this fork. Now let me get back to my story. Chunk, chunk, and it goes back in. And those are the pieces that I think are the tricky things to like maintain that the platform will still deliver. Because all the audio is like, I mean, I could hand the entire set of files off to anybody, but just making sure that all those pieces.
Have you got a website up with it? Are you going to have a website up with it?
We definitely will have. It'll be TrailOff.com, and the website's there. You can sign up to download the app. The full like gorgeous site itself with all of the background info and everything is like almost done, but not up just yet.
And you mentioned PEC, the Pennsylvania Environment Council.
Mm-hmm.
How did they sort of go with this? Because it's an interesting partnership, isn't it? You've got a tech company. You've got an environmental organisation that's obviously got a brief to work within, state sort of interests. And then you've got this highly experimental company that you're working with. It's an interesting relationship.
I mean, I think it is, if I will speak to my own talents, like it is my masterful partnering capacity. Right. There is, PEC has been, like I've done a lot of partnerships, and I've done partnerships with lots of kinds of institutions, and this was a risk for them. Like this is not a normal project for them, and they've been just super excited and trusting. And I think especially once they really started to hear the stories. I mean, I remember my main contact there, who's sort of the program officer for this, sitting with her boss, who is the head of the Philadelphia chapter, finishing one of the stories and just weeping, and they were just like, okay, we're in. And I think that, I know this is a project that's like really pushed some boundaries for them. And I think on my side, like I've really had to be willing to come to the table and be like, okay, I hear that these are your needs. This is not necessarily exactly how I'd want to do this as a scrappy experimental company, but I think both of us have, over the 2 years we've worked together, really developed like a very deep set of mutual interests that we're both really committed to. And I think for me, that's like the necessity of cross-disciplinary partnerships, or even like cross-cultural partnerships, just like making sure that you both really hear and want what the other side needs to happen. And if you're both in a place where you're committed to like continuing the conversation, I think it's a really special place that like often is not where these things get made from.
And it really speaks to, I suppose, the integrity of the creative work that you're bringing. It does raise for me, and I don't mean to be a curmudgeon, but it does raise for me sort of what the capacity for these sorts of projects are to be able to sustain themselves. And I think that it's a very difficult one. And like so many other location-based experiences now, because, we're kind of coming up to sort of 10, 15 years of locative audio and some really wild out there projects. so many of them have gone. They've just
Yeah.
disappeared. And when they've gone, they've gone.
Yeah.
They're sitting on someone's hard drive, but the actual system that facilitated them has collapsed, and there's no way you can get that back in again. And you know, PEC must have you know, good on them, because they've pulled off something that I think a lot of other environmental organizations wouldn't have the guts to take on.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that they'd be fine with me saying this. I don't think they totally knew what they were getting when they signed on for it. And I think that, so Lizzie Hessick, who is the program officer, and I have worked super duper closely. And I think that she has just loved every second of the project. And I think the fact that she has been so passionate, like, really is the reason that this project has happened. I think finding the advocate inside that organization made a huge difference, because she could then really sort of speak. It's not to say that the folks higher up in the chain didn't want this to happen, but I think she was able to really sort of see it at the ground level. And like, she was in the room with the artists in the workshops. She met them and talked to them and like connected them with nonprofit advocates who were on the trail so that they could get the information. I mean, she was in the dirt with us. And so I think having that experience, and like, you know, I mean, like, like one of our authors like had serious health issues, and so like I would pick her up from her house and like drive her onto the trail so that she could like get to the spaces. It was like such a hands-on process. And I think you're right, like I couldn't pick up and do another project like this from scratch. Like, it was huge and exhausting and totally worth it, but it was a needle to thread for sure.
Yeah, no, well done. I think it's really, really an amazing thing that you've pulled off, and that's one of the reasons, I suppose, why I wanted to interview you, is because if I've got an interview with this, I think I can point some of my people to what you're doing and sort of say, look what's going on. I don't know many projects of this magnitude around the world at the moment. I feel like I've got my head around quite a few projects, but most of them are fairly indie, bespoke. They're you know, smell of an oily rag projects where the relationship often between the producers and the developers is often, you know, kind of goes along for a while, but it can become a bit tenuous, particularly when there's got to be updates, or there's got to be operating system changes, or there needs to be bug fixes and all that sort of thing. So, you know, that relationship between you guys and Toaster Lab, I think that's a really interesting one. And I'd be really curious to hear if that goes places. I'd be really interested to hear sort of who's got ownership over this, the IP of this, and to what degree you might sort of consider sort of exploring this as a model for something that might continue. I think it's a really interesting question. Yeah.
I mean, I think we're all excited about it. I mean, I know part of the thing that I liked about Toaster Lab was that they had experience working with like a variety of communities, specifically with Indigenous communities. So that to me said that they're in a different kind of space than a lot of tech people are. And the whole project will be open source. Like, it will, like, we're going to put all of the code up so anybody else can see it. So I think that sense of generosity and gift and share, I mean, there's a reason that, like, from the beginning I said, if the point of this app is to reach people that aren't normally in these spaces, it has to be free. Like, we cannot be advertising, we cannot be tracking their data. You have to get it, and it has to feel like something that is truly a gift. And it is, you know, and I think that we worked really hard, like, throughout the process at every step to say, part of the work is about a spirit of generosity and that kind of space that you get when you are in nature, and that these places are collectively and publicly owned landscapes. And part of the work is about like reminding us all that like these aren't things that we own, these are places we like move through and exist in together.
And of course, we can't experience the stories unless we're actually on site. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the website won't be revealing the stories. You've got to actually go on site. The website kind of gives background and instructions and all that sort of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, it gives, it'll give you sort of the same thing you can see in the app if you're not on the site. Like it'll give you a summary, you can preview the audio, read about the authors, get some information about the trail sites and their partner nonprofit advocates, but you have to be there to hear them.
And the podcasts, I'm curious to see that you've got them in after the app. You've got some audio there, which is sort of the behind the scenes.
Yeah.
What was that like to make? I mean, that's an entirely different project in itself, really, isn't it?
I mean, it was a pretty, that was in some ways like the simplest piece of the whole thing. I mean, really what we did was and this was actually sort of the final piece that the authors did. They turned in their stories, we recorded them all, and we set up a day where they came in and we just had a conversation about where are you now at the end of this?
Yeah.
And so, kind of with the idea that this would be a conversation for people who had just listened to the story. They have to, in many cases, walk back the way they came. And so, what are you interested in?
That's really interesting. Yeah, that's a really nice adjunct. I didn't get that. I thought it was just when you'd finish, you'd get this optional podcast. Are the writers sort of, have you turned them on to locative audio? Are they thinking differently now about spatial narratives?
I did. It's funny. I should ask people more I should ask them. I mean, I don't know. I know a couple of them have gone on to play around with those kinds of things in their own writing. I mean, I know I've turned, one of my wins for the project. So the amazing poet, Afak, she said at the start of the project, she was like, I do not walk on trails. I do not do that. And my aim is to write a story that would make me or one of my aunties want to go on a trail. And I remember at the end of the process, she was like, okay, I like my trail. And I was like, yes. So I feel like I've won some people over to walking in nature.
That's possibly a cultural thing too, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, and I think that's part of the idea is that environmentalism is very white in the United States. And I think that that isn't a hard and fast thing. A lot to do with the culture of who's owned the spaces that advertise and claim environmentalism. And there's long systemic reasons for that. And part of the aim of the project is to say these are not just white spaces.
Possibly even scary spaces for people from other cultures.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, there are plenty of, there are plenty of undercurrents around I mean, one of the things I think is really interesting as a theater artist is to say you're literally walking a mile in someone's shoes. I mean, literally imagining being in this place from the perspective of a person. If you are a white audience member and you're in a story where you're imagining walking from another person's perspective, you might understand why people experience these places differently than you do. And that's part of, I think, part of the audience is about getting folks who maybe don't go to nature trails. But I think also part of the aim of the project is to get people who do think of these as their spaces to see them in new light.
So the kickoff is with this festival in September?
Yeah, so we're going to be part of the Fringe Arts Festival for the month of September. I think the official start of the festival is September 10th, and it'll be 4 weeks that we'll be kind of doing a series of kind of extra programming on top of it, we're imagining the authors might walk their trail and live stream themselves talking about creating it, or doing some environmental justice panels with some of the folks. So there'll be some extra goodies during the month of launch, and then it'll be available for a full year after that.
A full year. Who owns the system? Who owns it? Toaster Lab own it?
Well, I guess it depends on what you mean by the system.
The structure that contains it, the architecture of the technical.
So Toaster Lab created the map tool, which they're making open source.
Yeah.
Swim Pony like owns anything that is unique to the stories. So that's the like, you know, like definitive where it ends. I mean, I think one of the things that was exciting to me was that Toaster Lab was very upfront about like wanting to make it available to the public, so that it wouldn't be something that they would, you know, take and just like keep after development.
Oh, they sound like a great organization, really great organization. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, look, I think that's a wrap. Do you want to say anything else?
I feel like I should have some like verbal advice. I don't know. I mean, like, I just really, you know, I think it's one of the reasons I was so excited when you reached out again is I just feel like this, sometimes it feels very siloed doing this kind of work. I think like there are, the folks who are interested in it are just like maniacally excited about it. And I think personally, like having spent time in immersive audio and virtual reality, I am just like, who wants to put a hot brick on your face and like disconnect from your body?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm just excited to, I don't know, like hear from other folks who are in this realm, because I think
you're a convert to the locative audio kind of indie scene, really. I think you're coming over. I can feel it.
I just want to like be in the tribe of the folks that are doing this stuff.
Yeah, well done. I mean, it's a remarkable project and a 3-year project with so many people involved and so many skillful people involved. You know, you must be really proud of yourself. I think when you actually get out there with the app and you walk that trail, it's going to be an interesting moment for you. I know. Yeah. I have so many memories of walking trails and going like, what just happened?
I know. I just have to, I'm just like, well, we have however many, like whatever, July, August, we have, you know, a couple months before it has to be done.
Yeah. No, that'll be really interesting. And when it all works, it just rocks. It's wonderful.
Yeah.
So well done. And thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you.
I'll let you know if I put a link up on Storyland. I'd like to put it up. I'll just have a look and see how it kind of goes and put it up if I can. Find a minute in the next while. So yeah, I'd love to. I have to say, I'd love to get over to Pennsylvania. I'm in a PhD at the moment doing a study of locative audio. So at some point I'll be able to squander a little bit of money and travel overseas and test out a few more projects. So it'd be really cool if it was available when I was over there. Yeah.
Awesome.
All right. Thanks so much, Adrienne.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.